Lawyers, what's the worst thing you've seen someone do to another person in court? Story 1. Not a court case, but definitely legal related. My dad works as an executive safety officer at his company, and one of their truck drivers got into an accident. The driver wasn't at fault, but company policy requires a same-day drug test for any driver involved in an accident. When the results came back, the guy failed. He disputed the results, so they allowed him to retake the test. This time, when he handed over his sample, it was stone cold, nowhere near body temperature. The testing facility, which meticulously cleans its bathrooms between tests, later found a strip of tape and a small vial cap, the kind used for holding liquid samples. Since they couldn't definitively prove he tampered with the test, my dad had to be on a conference call with the driver, his manager, and other relevant parties. The driver kept insisting he was innocent, and without solid proof, they were at a standstill. Just as they were wrapping up the call, my dad casually asked, "Hey, doesn't taping the vial to your leg hurt? How do you get it off?" Without missing a beat, the guy replied, "Oh no, it was just painter's tape. Comes off easy, didn't hurt at all." 5 seconds of dead silence, then pure panic as he tried to backtrack. It was too late. He had just admitted to cheating. The company fired him without issue. Story 2. This reminds me of my last job where we handled drug testing. Some of the ways people try to beat the system are truly next level. One company had a worker they suspected of drug use, but every random test he took came back clean. They couldn't figure out how he was doing it. Every morning he claimed he couldn't go, then left for an hour lunch break, came back, and finally provided a sample, always clean. On the third test, they noticed something odd, traces of blood in his urine. That raised suspicion, so for the next test, they added a saliva test alongside the urine test. As expected, his urine sample was clean, but the saliva test came back loaded with cocaine. Turns out he had quite the system. On his lunch break at home, he would urinate to empty his bladder, then use a catheter to refill himself with clean urine he had bought. By the time he returned and gave a sample, everything was at body temperature and no drugs showed up. Story 3. I'm not a lawyer, but my ex absolutely sabotaged herself in our divorce proceedings. After we separated, we both moved in with family. Since school was out and we had no custody agreement yet, we were swapping the kids weekly. Then, one day while the kids were with her, she emailed me saying she had enrolled them in a school near her. The moment I got that email, I went straight to my attorney. He filed a motion for a temporary custody order until the divorce was finalized. Once he got the hearing date, he properly notified my ex and filed everything with the court. On the day of the hearing, I showed up. She didn't. The judge granted me temporary custody, which later became full custody when the divorce was finalized. I later found out why she missed the hearing. She thought my attorney was trying to trick her. So she called the court herself to verify the date, except, according to her, they gave her a completely different day, a day that happened to fall on a Sunday. To this day, I still don't get it. If someone were trying to trick you, wouldn't they give you a later date so you'd miss the real one? And even if she was unsure, why wouldn't she just show up anyway? Worst case, if it was fake, she could still attend the real one. And who doesn't double-check their calendar and notice something is off? Oh, and the best part? She never actually enrolled the kids in a school near her. She had made that up because she was mad at me about something. I don't even remember what. Story 4. A defendant trying to overturn a default judgment claimed he was never served, insisting it couldn't have been him. At the hearing, the process server testified that he immediately recognized the defendant in court because when he served him 2 years earlier, the guy had physically threatened him. To make things even more airtight, the process server had used a photo of the defendant, which my client had sourced from mugshots.com, to confirm the identity at the time of service. Needless to say, the judge wasn't buying the defendant's story. Story 5. I worked in the tax field for years, and I cannot stress enough how nasty ex-spouses and ex-partners can get, especially when it comes to money, tax credits, and deductions. I've seen people go out of their way to sabotage their former partner's finances, even if it meant hurting themselves in the process. Story 6. Not a lawyer, but when my father-in-law and mother-in-law got divorced, my Emil wanted to file jointly for the previous year. Since they were still legally married, they would have received a decent refund. My FIL refused. He insisted on filing separately, even though it meant he would owe $4,000, just so she would owe money too. His reasoning? He wanted to frost her ass. Story 7. Not a lawyer, but I was a jury foreman about 5 years ago on a case where a man was accused of attempting to kill his girlfriend. The charges ranged in severity, but the victim's testimony wasn't particularly convincing, especially after cross-examination. There was evidence that something had happened that night, but nothing definitively pointing to the boyfriend as the attacker. Then it was the defense's turn. Out of nowhere, court recessed for the day. The next morning, we found out why. The defendant insisted on testifying against his lawyers and the judge's advice. On the stand, he placed himself at the scene and straight up admitted to hitting her. We ended up convicting him on everything except attempted murder. After the trial, the judge came into the jury room and explained the recess had been because the defendant refused to listen to his lawyer. If he had just stayed quiet, we likely wouldn't have convicted him at all. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Story 8. I'm not a lawyer, but my parents' divorce was a complete disaster. Short version, my dad was a narcissistic jerk who emotionally abused us growing up. My mom had been a stay-at-home mom, then entered the workforce at minimum wage and worked her way up to management. My dad worked in a skilled trade for an auto company, making 3 to 4 times what she did, pulling in 6 figures. Early in the divorce proceedings, my mom tried to settle. All she really wanted was enough to cover health insurance, her biggest financial concern. My dad refused to give her anything. He hired a nasty lawyer who constantly insulted my mom to her face. This only made her fight harder, and she eventually asked for much more than she initially wanted. His lawyer told him not to worry, she wouldn't get a penny. After a year of legal battles, the judge ruled that my dad had to pay her $1,500 a month. 3 days later, my younger sister was at his house. When my mom came to pick her up, she noticed he hadn't gone to work yet. My sister went in to check on him and found him barely breathing, covered in vomit. He had overdosed on acetaminophen. There was an empty bottle of hydrocodone acetaminophen and a large bottle of Tylenol on his nightstand. Doctors couldn't say for certain how much he had taken, but based on the amount still in his blood and the extent of organ failure, they estimated there was a 70% chance it was intentional. The real kicker? He did this before transferring his new car into his name alone and before making any payments to my mom, other than splitting the proceeds from selling our house. We later found out that right before his overdose, he wrote his sister a $75,000 check with a note saying, "Don't let the girls have this," meaning my mom and sisters. Ford is still going after my mom for the car payments. The county administrator, a judge-appointed third party handling his affairs, waited nearly 2 years before finally allowing it to be repossessed, tanking her credit in the process. My sister, who was only 16 at the time, is still dealing with PTSD from finding him like that. And this is the short version of the story. My dad survived, but now has permanent damage, basically like someone who suffered a severe stroke. He's in an assisted living facility, and none of his kids have anything to do with him anymore. Story 9. I've been in a dispute with British Gas for nearly a decade. Every few years they take me to court, I win, and then they leave me alone for a while until the cycle starts again. The last time I decided to lawyer up. The case was in a magistrate's court, even though it was a civil matter. My solicitor waited until the British Gas representative swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then, he asked what the guy knew about the previous court cases. When the British Gas rep admitted he had no knowledge of them, my solicitor pounced. He tore into him, pointing out that he had just sworn an oath to tell the whole truth. Yet he clearly knew nothing. It was brutal, went on for several minutes. The magistrates agreed, dismissed the case, and awarded me £600 in costs. The best part? Before we went in, the British Gas rep was all smug, acting like they had the upper hand, even claiming they would gain entry to my house with police assistance. By the end of it, he was told to sit down and not speak unless spoken to. Oh, and they took 27 days to pay the £600, so we almost sent in the bailiffs, a little disappointed they finally paid up. For those wondering, this is all over a disconnected meter for an electric supply to a closed shop. I've written to the CEO, involved my MP, and been to court 4 times. British Gas never listens. So at this point, I just treat it as an occasional payday. Story 10. British Gas took my grandparents to court for non-payment of bills. The only problem? They had never had a gas connection. They owned their house from new. Everything was electric. No gas meter, no gas line, nothing. They explained this multiple times, but British Gas refused to listen, so my granddad got to enjoy his day in court, watching their case crumble. Story 11. British Gas must have the most incompetent legal department in existence. In any normal company, when a legal issue escalates, especially after a court loss, someone at the appropriate level, VP, director, whatever, steps in to fix things. Even massive corporations don't have that many legal cases going on at once. If something strange happens, it should get escalated and resolved. But not British Gas. They just keep throwing the same nonsense at the wall, hoping it'll stick. Story 12. My house almost went up for tax sale over $7. I paid a water bill on a Monday, a day or two late, and owed about 6 cents. Because I paid after the office's internal cutoff time, but before their actual closing time, their system charged me an extra day of interest. Normally this would get reconciled the next day, but someone must have missed it. So my account showed a tiny outstanding balance. But since there was no official payment due date, the system defaulted to January 1st, 1970, the start date for Unix-based systems. The next morning, their system flagged it as an almost 50-year-old unpaid tax debt. Over time, that 6 cents had accumulated about $7 in interest, and since the system saw it as decades overdue, my house was immediately scheduled for tax sale. As in, anyone could have walked into the township building that Saturday and bought my house for $7. Luckily, I caught it on Thursday. It took about 3 minutes to clear everything up, and they wiped the debt away. But still, that's how close I came to losing my home over pocket change. Story 13. Not a lawyer, but this is my personal story. When I was 4, I had 3 older siblings, 2 brothers, 10 and 13, and a sister, 7. My dad was fighting for custody of all of us since we only spent weekends with him. During those visits, we'd tell him about the bad things happening at home with our mother. When we went to court, the judge ruled that we were old enough to decide where we wanted to live. Since I was too young to choose, my sister would make my choice for me. My mom knew she was about to lose all of us. She was fully aware we preferred our dad. That's when, out of nowhere, she stood up in court and said, "You can have all of them, but me isn't even yours, so you can't have her." The entire courtroom was in shock. My dad was speechless. My family was crying. No one knew why she would say something like that. Because of this, the judge ordered a DNA test, but regardless of the results, my dad was still on my birth certificate, meaning the custody decision wouldn't change. The judge granted extra time for the test and to give my dad time to process everything. My mom wasn't particularly fond of any of us, especially my brothers, so she had already accepted losing them. But if she lost all of us, she'd no longer receive benefits or money from my dad. She needed at least one child with her. During the delay, she convinced my sister that if she stayed, she'd get everything she wanted: ice cream, toys, later bedtimes, you name it. When the time came, my brothers chose my dad, my sister chose my mom, and since she was deciding for me, I was forced to stay. I had a rough childhood because of that choice, and to this day, my sister regrets it. She never got any of the things she was promised. No treats, no toys, nothing. As for my mother's claim, she wasn't lying. My dad wasn't my biological father. My family said this weighed on him for years. He remained an incredible father to me, but sometimes something would trigger a deep emotional reaction from him, and that was the reason why. It changed both of our lives forever. Story 14. This wasn't my case, but I followed it closely because it involved an acquaintance's messy divorce. He and his ex-wife co-owned a commercial property worth a significant amount of money. Both had access to the financial records, but when she ran into financial trouble, the husband tried to discuss it with her. She completely ignored him. On top of that, she started cheating on him. Fast forward to the divorce. It was bitter, and they were fighting over everything, especially the primary residence. The house had a lower market value than the commercial property, but it was paid off. She insisted on getting the house, so in what seemed like a generous offer, the husband agreed. If she took the commercial property, he'd keep the house. She agreed without looking into the financial situation. Her lawyer didn't do any due diligence either, so she ended up with a heavily indebted commercial property while her ex walked away with a mortgage-free home. Her own disinterest led her to trade a stable asset for a financial disaster. Story 15. A woman filed for a restraining order against her husband during their divorce, not because she was in danger, but because she wanted to secure the house. Her husband had a high-paying job, making around $200K a year. Unfortunately for her, his employer found out about the restraining order and fired him. His job was highly specialized, and the best position he could find nearby paid only $50K. With his new income, the house went into foreclosure. His child support payments dropped to under $500 a month. The wife, who had never worked before, was forced to get a job as a waitress. To top it all off, 4 of their cars were repossessed. Story 16. When I was a kid, my dad got a ticket for running a stop sign. He decided to fight it because the sign was completely buried in a bush and wasn't visible from the road. Both he and the police officer who issued the ticket showed up to court at the appointed time, but the judge was nowhere to be found. After waiting about 20 minutes, the bailiff apologized and told them they could leave since the hearing would be rescheduled. Not long after they left, the judge finally arrived and immediately found both my dad and the officer in contempt for wasting her time. That one $80 ticket turned into 2 $500 contempt of court fines. A few years later, a friend of mine had the same judge for a DUI case, prescription medication, not alcohol. He didn't realize he wasn't supposed to drive on them. He showed up without a lawyer. When he tried to speak, she told him, "If you're dumb enough to represent yourself, you can sit there and say nothing." So he sat there in silence and lost his license on a first offense. There were multiple news articles and letters to the editor about what a disaster she was as a judge, so I know plenty of others had similar experiences. Story 17. A man representing himself in court tried to sue a well-respected surgeon, claiming that the surgeon's physician assistant wasn't qualified to assist with procedures or follow-ups. During cross-examination, he smugly asked the surgeon, "Do you honestly think physician assistants know what they're doing? Do you even know what's reasonable to expect from one?" The surgeon, who had been patient and polite throughout the trial, calmly replied that he was the one who founded the physician assistant profession in the United States. He explained that the idea came to him while serving in combat, where medics had been invaluable in helping him treat overwhelming numbers of casualties. Then he added, "And yes, I have a very good one at the hospital." That was the end of that argument. Story 18. I used to do IT support for a retired surgeon who had transitioned into academia, fundraising, and expert witness work. He had a large office set up specifically for depositions. During one case, an opposing lawyer confronted him with a passage from a medical textbook, trying to use it against him. The lawyer confidently asked, "Doesn't this passage prove you were wrong?" The surgeon calmly pointed out that he had personally corresponded with the author of that book, convinced him the information was incorrect, and collaborated on the revision for the next edition. Then he offered to pull up the correspondence as proof. Story 19. Not a lawyer, but my dad is a physician, and sometimes serves as an expert witness in malpractice cases. In one case, a family was suing a doctor over something fairly frivolous, and my dad was called as a witness for the defense. The plaintiff's lawyer tried to trap him by pulling out a medical textbook and highlighting a passage. Lawyer: "So, what you just read means incorrect medical interpretation, correct?" Dad: "No, it does not mean that." Lawyer: "But if you read XYZ, the author clearly states incorrect medical claim." Dad: "No, really, that's not what the author meant." Lawyer: "And how exactly do you know that's not what the author meant?" Dad: "Because I wrote it." The judge face-palmed. The lawyer went silent, staring at the author's name on the book. Easiest case win ever. Story 20. This guy and his lawyer kept missing court appearances, sometimes one of them, sometimes both, offering last-minute excuses that became increasingly ridiculous. First, he claimed he had left the country without knowing about the hearing, but his own lawyer stood in court and said he had told him beforehand. Then, he insisted he was in a former Soviet bloc country undergoing fertility treatments and that returning would ruin everything. Another time, he was visiting dying relatives on another continent. Then, on his way to the airport, he suddenly had a medical emergency and produced an admitting form in another language. When we translated it, it did confirm he had been admitted, but also that he had been discharged. He even tried firing his attorney to buy more time, only for the new lawyer to show up saying he hadn't been able to reach his client and needed an adjournment. Some lawyers straight up said they hadn't been paid and wanted to be removed from the case. We kept telling the judge this was a stalling tactic, but he kept giving the guy the benefit of the doubt, even after we showed him records of other cases where the same guy had skipped court appearances and been threatened with sanctions. Finally, the judge had enough. He told the guy, "I don't care if you're meeting with the Pope, I'm ordering you to be here." The guy still didn't show up. Boom. His answer was stricken. Default judgment granted in full to our side. Neither he nor his lawyer showed up for the hearing where the judge determined the exact amount of damages. Then, after all that, he had the nerve to file a motion claiming the judgment was unfair because he didn't get a chance to dispute anything. Story 21. I'm not a lawyer, but there was a hilarious case in my town between a father and son. The father, a well-known personal injury attorney, had built a successful law firm under his name, George Sink. His son joined the firm and worked there for years, until they had a falling out. The son left to start his own law firm. The problem? He has the same name as his dad. So the father sued his own son for using the very name he gave him. Story 22. This is one of the biggest self-owns in legal history. The MPAA sued DVD John, the guy who cracked DVD copy protection. As part of their lawsuit, they submitted his code into evidence. Since court filings are public record, that meant the code, the very thing they were trying to suppress, became freely available to the entire world. The lawsuit achieved the exact opposite of what they wanted. Story 23. I was sitting in court waiting for my client when the judge was giving a group of defendants a mass colloquy for an alternative DUI program, basically probation. The judge asked, "Has anyone consumed alcohol or taken drugs in the last 24 hours? Common sense says the answer is no. One guy proudly raises his hand and says, "I smoked some dope last night." He did not get probation. Story 24. I was a brand new lawyer with zero bankruptcy experience when a partner sent me to bankruptcy court to try and make a claim as a creditor. The claim was related to a $50 million building that was being sold. The court quickly dismissed my client's claim, ruling that we weren't actually a creditor because our claim was against a tenant, not the building owner. Which was correct. In reality, we had purchased the claim just to try and wedge our way into buying the property, something the judge saw right through. Since my part was over, I just sat back and watched the real fight. Two powerhouse bankruptcy attorneys were going at it, one representing the debtor, the building owner, the other representing a secured creditor with a lien on the building. These two absolutely hated each other, and the arguments were venomous. Then, during a short break, something happened. When court resumed, the secured creditor's attorney calmly told the judge his client had just purchased a controlling interest in the debtor, the building owner. His client had directed him to fire the opposing attorney. His client had also directed him to withdraw the motion to sell the building. Then, right there in the packed courtroom, he fired his rival and withdrew the motion. It was the most badass legal move I've seen in my entire career. Those two attorneys despised each other, and in one swift move, one had completely outmaneuvered the other. The entire courtroom was stunned. Even after nearly 3 decades in LA. Story 25. This is one of my favorite moments from practicing family law. I was litigating a custody dispute for the mother in an ultra-conservative jurisdiction. One of the most common ways to attack a parent's credibility in these cases was to accuse them of having addiction, because the threshold for proving it was basically non-existent. Luckily, we got a judge I knew from previous cases, so I had some confidence going in. Before the hearing, opposing counsel tried to gotcha me into settling by showing me surprise sex between my client and her new boyfriend. But this isn't Law and Order. You can't just drop last-minute evidence like that. We proceeded with the hearing. I objected to the text being admitted, but said I'd allow them to be read into the record in their entirety. So, for the next 25 minutes, this prim and proper, ultra-conservative attorney had to stand there and read explicit sex out loud in open court. Occasionally, she'd pause and ask if she could skip certain parts, but I made it clear that wouldn't be appropriate. The best moment? Hearing her awkwardly struggle over the word nipple. It's not even a dirty word. This was the third hearing where the dad had tried to amend custody based on his ex-wife having a boyfriend, claiming she was a sex addict. His entire argument was that these sex had happened while their child was in her custody. However, he had based that claim on the screenshot timestamp, not the actual text timestamp. The messages were sent at a time when the child wasn't even there. The judge had finally had enough. He awarded attorneys fees and added a provision under the vexatious litigant statute, stating that if the dad kept pushing these baseless claims, he would continue to be liable for her legal fees. It was one of Story 26. I'm currently representing the sweetest old lady in a case that makes my blood boil. Her neighbor convinced her that her house was basically worthless, claiming it needed major repairs, that fixing it would bankrupt her, and that she should just sell it to him. The next day, he showed up with a pile of documents for her to sign. She has an eye condition, didn't read a thing, and signed everything. When she finally saw a lawyer to close the deal, the lawyer immediately realized something was wrong. The purchase price? Only 36% of the actual market value, and the supposed major repairs were minor things, like fixing a bathroom faucet. Even worse, she had no idea she would have to move out. She genuinely thought she could stay in the house until she died. Now, she's living off a modest pension, and this guy is suing her for the house. His strategy? Bleed her dry with legal fees until she caves. I absolutely hate people like this. Story 27. Not my case, but one my dad handled decades ago when he was the equivalent of a public defender. There was a guy notorious for getting arrested every weekend. Drunk in public, public lewdness, you name it. He was such a regular that courthouse staff and judges all knew him. One day, he was back in front of a judge, this time for drunk driving. The judge was about to give him jail time when the guy started crying, swearing he had finally turned his life around. He had landed a job out of town and was leaving for good. The judge, feeling a bit lenient, told him, "As long as I never see you in my courtroom again, I'll drop the charges." Sure enough, the following Monday, there he was. Same courtroom, same judge, same charge. My dad was assigned his case. The judge glared at him. "I gave you a chance." The guy sobbed and said, "Your Honor, I was leaving town, but my friends threw me a going-away party." The judge was not amused. My dad had to fight to keep a star. Story 28. A lawyer I knew once had case defending a man accused of a serious crime. While the police and prosecution suspected him, there was no hard evidence tying him to the crime, only circumstantial at best. She had prepped him thoroughly, telling him to stay silent and let her handle everything. She gave a strong defense, pointing out the lack of solid evidence. For once, case seemed to be going her way. Then, at the end, The judge turned to her client and asked, "Do you have anything to add?" The guy looked at his lawyer, looked at the judge, started tearing up, and blurted out, "I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again." The lawyer, in shock, threw her notes at him right then and there. He had just convicted himself. Story 29. Not a lawyer, but this happened to me and some college buddies. We rented a 5-bedroom house in college, and being a bunch of college guys, we partied hard and were pretty rough on the place. We knew from the start we weren't getting our deposit back. About halfway through our lease, the septic system started acting up. If someone used the downstairs shower, it would drain really slowly, and one of the bedroom's carpets would randomly get wet. We emailed the property management company about it. 2 weeks later, they finally sent a plumber. He snaked the line and left. Problem not solved, so we emailed again. Another 2 to 3 weeks go by. Another plumber comes out, snakes the line, leaves. Still not fixed. Third time around, after another long wait, they finally scoped the line. Turns out roots had grown into the pipes, completely messing up the drainage. It took a big, expensive process to clear them out, but eventually it was fixed. We all moved out and went our separate ways. One of my buddies went to Australia for 9 months. When he got back, he found a bunch of voicemails from the property company saying we owed them $5,000 on top of losing our deposit. They tried to pressure him into paying, saying he'd be taken to court if he didn't. He told them, "See you in court." For months, they kept calling, offering deals. Pay $2,000 and give us contact info for another person on the lease and we'll drop it. He refused every time. Finally, court day arrived. The first hearing was just a scheduling session, but the property company's lawyer showed up completely unprepared. He had nothing, no records beyond the original lease, which had changed multiple times as roommates moved in and out. My buddy, being helpful, handed over every email we had sent them about the septic issue and all the damage it caused. The lawyer said he'd follow up with how they wanted to proceed. We never heard from them again. Story 30. I had a client accused of a very serious offense, the kind of charge that, if convicted, meant offender registry and serious jail time. Fortunately, he had a solid alibi, he was at work, and he was the boss. One of his employees could vouch for him. I spoke to the employee, and he confirmed my client was there during the time of the alleged offense. Perfect. Now, in my jurisdiction, if you're using an alibi defense, you have to file an alibi notice in advance, so the prosecution has time to investigate it. As we got closer to trial, I decided to double check and called the employee again. Turns out my client had fired him in the meantime. The employee, now pissed off, casually told me, "Oh yeah, he was definitely at work, but that's not what I'll say in court. That guy, he's going down." I did not file the alibi notice. I did not call him as a witness, still won the trial, but if I hadn't double checked, my client would have walked straight into a guilty verdict with zero. Story 31. A witness for the plaintiff in a civil case testified strongly against the company being sued. She claimed to be just a casual work acquaintance of the plaintiff, nothing more than work friends. I pinned her down on that statement. Then I got the chance to cross-examine the plaintiff. Turns out she had no choice but to completely discredit her own witness. Not only were they not just work friends, but they were actually sisters-in-law and had been for several years. I still don't understand why people try to downplay small biases when it completely destroys their credibility, but it happens more often than you'd think. Story 32. A friend of mine kept meticulous records of how much time his estranged wife actually spent with their daughter. He used pink highlighter for her time and blue for his. She went into arbitration demanding full custody, child support, and the house. He calmly pulled out 3 years' worth of color-coded calendars, the total time she had spent with their child. Less than 1 full month in 3 years. She was not happy with the outcome. Story 33. I represented a client trying to get a restraining order against her abusive ex. He showed up to the final hearing, making a big scene. His main concern, a truck they had purchased during their marriage. He insisted it was his alone because, according to him, their marriage was void. On cross-examination, I asked him what he meant by that. He confidently explained that he was already married in another state when he married my client. She had no idea, but in his mind this meant their marriage was invalid and the truck belonged to him. Not only was his legal argument completely wrong, but he had also just confessed to bigamy, and the police were already investigating him for it. The court transcript was promptly handed over to law enforcement. Oh, and the judge gave my client the truck, along with a 2-year no-contact order. Story 34. I took my ex to court because she stole my identity to sign up for cable. I found out when she stopped paying the bill, and I started getting collection notices. In court, I submitted the contract from the cable company, my social security number, her own name signed at the bottom. She didn't even try to forge my signature. She just signed her own name, and then tried to deny she had anything to do with it. The judge ripped her apart. It was glorious. Story 35. Not someone else, My own client screwed themselves. I was handling a landlord-tenant case where my client was being evicted for non-payment of rent, but they weren't actually refusing to pay. They were withholding rent due to serious habitability issues, no heat, high lead levels, vermin infestation. This was going to be an easy win. I had one job for my client: do not spend the rent money. Judges love when tenants can show they have the money, but are withholding it for legitimate reasons. It makes them look reasonable instead of just broke. We get to court, and the landlord doesn't even have an attorney. I'm practically celebrating inside. There's no way I can lose this. I make my argument. The landlord makes his. The judge asks my client, "Do you still have the rent money?" My client shrugs and says, "Nah, I blew that smutch at the casino last week." I lost. Story 36. I represented a guy who stole 3 trucks from his workplace. Before trial, only 2 had been recovered. He showed up to a motion hearing driving the 3rd one. Story 37. I was serving in the U.S. Navy when this case blew up, mostly because it involved a fellow sailor. A submariner went through a divorce, and due to his deployment schedule, his ex-wife was initially granted custody of their son. Later, however, she lost custody after being convicted of child abuse and neglect. She was not happy about this because it meant her free money was gone. The submariner, now stationed in California, gave his girlfriend guardian rights over his son while he was deployed. His ex-wife, still living in Michigan, saw an opportunity. She waited until he was out on deployment, knowing he'd have no way to receive communication, and served him with papers for a custody battle. The court date was set for the following month. The issue? Submarines don't have regular communication. They surface every couple of months, and even then, messages are limited. That's why sailors often give power of attorney to a trusted family member or partner while deployed. So the trial happened without him even knowing about it. A female judge presided over the case, sympathized with the ex-wife, and decided children belong with their mother, not some random woman. The abuse conviction was probably false. She awarded custody back to the ex-wife by default. Then she tried to hold the submariner in contempt of court for not showing up. That's when his chain of command found out. Here's the thing. It's illegal in the U.S. to punish a service member for missing a court date due to military operations or deployment. His CO got JAG involved, and they assigned him a lawyer. The lawyer appealed the decision all the way to the Michigan State Supreme Court. The result? The original judge is no longer a judge. The ex-wife is now permanently labeled unfit to care for children. The submariner kept custody of his son. Justice served.